So in this unit, we've talked and drilled down on quite a few subjects already, and just want to remind you what those are. Economic profit versus your accounting profit, and opportunity cost that's involved in the economic profits. We've talked just recently about actually what the production actually is. It's converting inputs into outputs in a real simplified fashion. And next is we want to talk a little bit about fixed and variable inputs. Okay, and those of you that have been in business or have studied business can recognize these things fairly easily. Okay, fixed and variable inputs, and they might be a little bit different as far as what kind of business that we're talking about. But these are just a separation of the two kinds of things that we use within as resources in the business. So the fixed inputs are those whose rate does not change as the output level changes. So if I introduce you to that first, because as a variable input, it is the things that change. When we scale the production, or we increase or decrease the production, the variable inputs will be the things that actually change within a time horizon. So if we were to have a list of resources, then even any kind of business we might need, and the internet has changed a lot of those things, but land might be actually considered a fixed input. So those kinds of things, if we were to scale it and increase the capacity by increasing the size of the factory on that petite piece of land, that might be considered a variable input if we were to change it, and it changed the output. So fixed inputs are things that we can think about at least within a scale of outputs that just doesn't change. Okay, property taxes are another thing that may not change because of our level of output, or we can even consider the amount of sales that we have. Maybe even the manager's wages wouldn't change too much, at least the base pay. If there's a commission involved for any of your employees, or in this case the manager, then that portion may be considered on the variable end of the input scale. Insurance coverage typically covers a broad range of revenue. So throughout this whole process, and you scale your business from, you might get insurance that covers from $250,000 worth of gross revenues to $500,000 worth of gross revenues, and cover your liability exposure within your business. So that would be considered throughout that process, or those two different ranges. Through that range would be an actual fixed cost until you changed your business and had to increase your level of output or level of revenue. In this case, we're talking about specifically. So that's the easy part. The fixed part is identifying those things. And the variable inputs, the simple definition is just this: it changes with the level of production. Inputs whose use rate changes as the output level changes. Okay, and in farming, we talk about the really easy one is fertilizer and water. Is that we can get increased output if we apply more fertilizer, and at the level of water actually has a tendency to increase the level of output because of how much water. Now we can always, and we'll get into this later on, we can always put on too much of any of these inputs and actually get less output. But it does change with the level of input. It can be negative. And we'll study that one with a little more depth as we go along. The more people that we have hired can vary our output. So that would be a variable input to a production process. So you can come up with some other examples, and that might be one of the test questions that I give you. Is here's a list of inputs, which ones are fixed and which ones are variable, given this scenario. Okay, so when we're talking about this thing, and I know Adam, hey out there, I know you're on the other side of the screen, but you had a question like this earlier in class about the length of run, and whether it's in the short run or the long run. Let me address that really quick before we actually talk about our thought processes as we go through most of this. The day-to-day decisions that those of us that are managing these companies and firms are typically mostly short-run decisions. So the typical small business and even large firms deal with the typical decisions that they deal with are on the short run. Okay, and what the overriding all these decisions is we have to actually put our business in a position so that we win in the long run, because that's the end game. And so most of our decisions as we go through them are in the short run, and we're dealing with that for the most part. But those real thinkers and those skilled managers that have some experience and that sort of thing actually take into account the long run. So there's a little bit of different processes going on when we mix this bundle of inputs to get an output. And we talk about the length of run. The length of run can be either short run or long run. And it can be different for any kind of production process that we might have within our businesses. Okay, so Main Street business, building length of the lease contract. That could be the short run. At the end of that lease contract is when we get to actually go in there and negotiate a new lease. So that input becomes variable. When that contract becomes variable, or it can be changed, is when it becomes variable, if that makes sense. Okay? Depreciation and maintenance on owned buildings and assets can be a fixed input, okay, when we're talking about a variable input to the production process. But if we look into the long run process, we may depreciate a particular piece of equipment totally out. It may be all worthless. We might have to just haul it out and scrap and that sort of thing. We're going to have to replace it. Then we're into the long run of that production process. So a wheat farmer, one crop year is another example. So as we've talked about in the past on the supply side of things, there is actually a time element in any supply side of things. And once you make the decision and have committed to a crop of wheat, and you have put the seed in it, you put the fertilizer on, you possibly irrigated it, and that sort of thing, those things become fixed in the long run. But during the process, if we get over into the next season, I'm making decisions as a manager that would actually, I could change. So that would be a short run type of a decision. And just to give you a little bit of prepaid insurance is one that we deal with in business all the time. You have to pay for it before you actually get to use it. And at that time, it would be very much a fixed type of input. But at the end of that contract period, it becomes variable as we renegotiate those sorts of things. Okay? So a long run period is sufficiently long enough that all resources are considered variable. Okay? So that's the major thing if we're talking about length of run. Now, most of the time within this class, we're going to talk about short run, because that's 99% of the decisions made by managers are in the short run. But if you're not thinking about the long run, overarching all these short run decisions, then you're probably not going to survive too long in business. Okay. Anyway, there's some examples of length of run there. So we're getting down to the point where we can make a statement, and maybe what I want you to consider is that we might even be able to graph this. Economists love to graph things, right? And I'm not going to bore you with actually trying to draw a graph on the board, because you already seen my artistic abilities, and they're not very interesting. But the things that we're going to talk about are going to be variable inputs and how they affect our production in one way or the other. And if we can linearly graph these things, then we can actually find an equation that fits that line mathematically. That's why we have you take all these college algebra classes and that sort of thing. And we're going to actually bring a little bit of the real world into all that abstract thinking, and use some of that abstract thinking in order to fit a line and a possible equation to the production process. And if you go into higher level economics, most of it will be higher level calculus. So, and people that don't like math all of a sudden figure out that math is really important to figuring out these processes, and very useful in the whole scheme of things. So in the long run, the manager is actually thinking on these levels. So what if I increase my input by 50%? Will that increase my output by 50%? Will it actually scale it so that my output increases by 75% or 100% because I used more of a particular input? Those are interesting questions to those of us that are in business. And that's what they're really talking about when you hear the phrase scale the business. Many times we become more efficient as we're able to scale out the use of these inputs. And that's more of a long-run subject when we visit about those kinds of things. So, quick review. The object of a perfectly competitive firm is to maximize profit. You will be asked this very soon. So, and these are used to help determine the most profitable investment resources. That would be opportunity costs. Okay, if you have some money in the bank and it's getting 0.07% interest, is there what's the next best alternative? Can I put it in a long-term investment like real estate and get a better return? Can I put it in the stock market? Can I invest in my own business? Can I invest in a friend's business? All those kinds of things, we would use opportunity costs in order to determine where the next best alternative is. Of course, in a lot of those, you can always ask the question is, how much risk am I taking on? What's the worst case scenario? What's the best case scenario? What's the middle ground? All those kind of questions need to be answered too. So we can identify some of these. Typically in the short run, where we can separate different resources into two categories, one being fixed, one being variable inputs. So typically land is going to be a fixed input in the short run. Fuel, the more fuel I use, typically will affect the output. So that is a changing input for the changing output, which puts it into the variable input. the amount of fertilizer I put on. And I give this one an example. Even if you're not a farmer, many of us have seen the effects of actually putting on a little bit of fertilizer with putting on a little more fertilizer with putting on too much fertilizer. We change the level of output, how green our grass is, how fast the growth is in our yard, and that sort of thing. And that would be considered a variable input. We get a change in the output because of the change in the input. How many people we hire within our business. So labor is a variable input. Structures and buildings and factories are actually a fixed input as long as we don't change them. So in the short run, those would be considered fixed inputs. Okay, so I'll conclude this video. This is production number 3 in a series of videos on the production economics portion of the course. Thank you so much. Look forward to any of your questions on any of this, and we'll pause now.